Provoke not your children to wrath, but nurture them in the chastening and admonition of the Lord. As fathers, we have been given the command by God that we're supposed to nurture our children in the chastening and admonition of the Lord. And we followed that pattern a little bit in our lessons today. I think this morning there was some chastening that was going on. But I want this evening to think a little bit about the admonition. And what I would like to do is try and give you a glimpse into the future of what it could be like with your children. How about now? Is that better? Okay, thumbs up. So there's a family that we're close to back in Lufkin, where we live. We have lived there 13 years now, and so I've reached a point in my preaching career where I'm doing lots of weddings, because there's kids that have grown up, now they're getting married, they're asking me to perform wedding ceremonies. And there's a family there that the parents are about 12 years older than Stephanie and I, and so they're about 12 years ahead of us in terms of where they are as a family. And I perform the wedding ceremonies for both of the daughters in this family. Like us, they have two daughters. Like us, those daughters are 3 years apart. And the personalities of the older daughter and younger daughter match up very closely to the personalities of my older daughter and my younger daughter. And so in performing the wedding ceremony for the younger of those two young ladies now, I see her walking down the aisle, being walked down the aisle by her father. And all of a sudden, I get this glimpse of the future. And I'm trying to not get emotional here. I got to perform this wedding ceremony, but I see my future of marrying off my own daughters, and I kind of got emotional in that moment. But what snapped me out of it was, I hope that's my future. Because both of those girls are faithful Christians. Both of those girls married faithful Christian men. Both of them now are active and working in the local churches where they are. That's exactly the kind of future that I want for my daughters. And so I want you to take out your Bible, if you would, and turn to Psalm 128, the 128th Psalm. And what we're going to see in this psalm is it shows us what the fruit of our labor could be, what we can sow from what we're reaping if we're reaping the things of God as fathers and as families. Psalm 128 in your Bible as we think about the family man who fears God. So just a second here to thank you again for allowing us to be with you this weekend, for your very good attention and participation. It's almost a little unfair because Stephanie and I had so much fun yesterday in those sessions, those workshop sessions. And I hope the things that we've talked about this weekend will be helpful to all of you, as we're all just doing the best we can to try and get our kids to heaven. Psalm 128 is what's called a psalm of ascents, sometimes called a psalm of steps or a psalm of degrees. It is believed that this series of psalms here in the 120s, that these were sung by the Jews, including the Jews of Jesus' day, as they were coming up to the temple to worship on various feast days, even as they were walking up the steps to the temple. And some of those steps survive even until today. And you can imagine that these Jews from all over the known world coming together in Jerusalem to worship. We're told in Luke chapter 2 and verse 41 that Jesus' parents, Joseph and Mary, as good practicing Jews, every year on the Passover feast, the whole family would come up to Jerusalem for that feast. In Acts chapter 2 in verses 5 through 11, we are told that there were Jews on that occasion from every nation under heaven in Jerusalem for the Passover feast. And when the text lists where they were from, it's literally every point of the compass. They're from the north and the south and the east and the west. Jews have come from all over to Jerusalem for Passover. And what most of these Jewish families would do is they would come for Passover, they would go through the Passover feast and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and they would stay for 50 days like an extended family reunion and vacation in Jerusalem until the day of Pentecost. And so you can imagine, can't you? You can imagine coming to Jerusalem with your family and you've got a place to stay somewhere on the outskirts of Jerusalem, and everybody is coming up to the temple in order to worship. And on your way, you're singing these psalms that were set to some tune that has been lost to history. But you're singing these psalms together, and you see other families who are coming out of their houses, and the crowd is growing and growing, and the voices are blending together until you're walking up the very steps of the temple. And you see other families who are trying to do exactly what you're doing in worshiping God and raising children who are worshiping God as well. And these psalms were a yearly reminder and encouragement and admonition for many areas of life and worship to God. But Psalms 127 and 128 are specifically about the family. So let's read this psalm together. Psalm 128, beginning in verse 1. Blessed is everyone who fears the Lord, who walks in his ways. When you eat the labor of your hands, you shall be happy. That's that same word as blessed in verse 1. And it shall be well with you. Your wife shall be like a fruitful vine in the very heart of your house. Your children like olive plants all around your table. Behold, thus shall the man be blessed who fears the Lord. The Lord bless you out of Zion, and may you see the good of Jerusalem all the days of your life. Yes, may you see your children's children. Peace be upon Israel. What we see in this psalm is that it describes this family man who is trying to do what's right as a husband and a father. He fears God, and he wants his family to fear God. And the psalm lays forth the kind of ideal scenario of the kind of fruit that can come from that kind of family. It begins with a general principle in verse 1. Blessed is everyone who fears the Lord, who walks in his ways. Now this is synonymous, parallel imagery here. The man who fears the Lord is the one who walks in the Lord's ways. The wise man Solomon, who wrote Psalm 127 and likely wrote Psalm 128 as well, he said in Ecclesiastes chapter 12 and verse 13, "Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep His commandments, for this is man's all." That's what life's about, isn't it? That summarizes what our life should be as Christians, as people, as husbands, as fathers, as wives, as mothers, as children. Fear God and keep His commandments. This is man's whole duty. This is man's all. And this is the path to true blessings, both physically and spiritually. And we could apply that general principle to all areas of life, right? Work. Well, fear God and keep His commandments. Fear God more than my boss, more than losing my job, more than making money, and keep God's commandments in the work that I do. We could apply it to school for you younger people. Fear God and keep His commandments. Fear God and keep His commandments more than popularity, more than teachers, more than my coach and his or her demands. I'm going to keep the commands of God. And if I do those two things, fear God and keep His commandments, well, I'm well on my way to being who God has called me to be. But this psalm makes a specific application, and the specific application is to the family. Verse 4, "Behold, thus shall the man be blessed who fears the Lord." And in between, in verses 2 and 3, we see this man described. We see his life described, and it describes a family. We see a number of specific applications. Number one, a thriving, godly family requires godly work. Look there in verse 2. "When you eat the labor of your hands, you shall be happy, and it shall be well with you." Literally, that is, when you eat the fruit of your labor. And that metaphor is closely followed by the wife and children. And how are the wife and children described? Well, your wife shall be like a fruitful vine in the very heart of your house. Your children like olive plants all around your table. we see this idea of the wife and children described as growing vines and olive trees. And what do those two things have in common? Well, they're plants, but they both produce fruit. And so the concept is you reap what you sow as a general principle. And so grapes and wine and oil, all of those come from that process of sowing and reaping. And all of those things are symbolic of God's great blessings. In fact, in the Old Testament, the most blessed life, if you want to think about this as the ideal life full of blessings in the Old Testament, it is when you're able to sit under your own vine and your own olive tree. That means that God really loves you and you're doing what's right and you've been blessed by Him. When you sit under your own vine and your own olive tree. But here, the psalmist says that a vine and an olive tree is what? It's your family. It's your wife and your children. And those are the greatest blessings that you can have. Here, those things are your family. And so my question is, are you sowing for your spouse, for your wife, or for your husband to grow and thrive in your home? Husbands, is your wife in the very heart of your home, that she wants to be there, that this is her place of safety and belonging, not the house, but the family? She is, this woman described in Psalm 128, is exactly the opposite of the woman found in Proverbs 7 and verse 11, whose feet will not stay at home. She doesn't want to be at home. She doesn't want to be in that environment. She would rather be anywhere else but there. And yet here we find this wife in the very heart of her house. Men, what is important to your wives in making the home a place where she wants to be in the very heart of it? Whatever that is, a good place to start is to ask her. Ask her what she needs to make this a home. And do everything in your power to make it that way. Husbands and wives, are you working on this relationship? Is it a priority for you? There's a saying that Stephanie and I love that we talk about a lot. The grass is greener where you water it. Right now we have a big drought in Lufkin. All of our grass is brown and dead. And we come here and it's green everywhere. Why? Because you've received water and we haven't. The grass is greener where you water it. Are you watering in your family? Are you watering in your marriage? And sometimes we get to a point in our marriages where it's just like, but things have gone downhill, they've gone sideways so long, where do we start? May I humbly suggest you start with one godly act followed by another, whether that act is reciprocated by your spouse or not. And if the vine has been neglected for some time, it's going to take more time and more work for it to be fruitful. But this relationship is vitally important to the rest of the family. And if this relationship is healthy, your spouse becomes a source of blessing and celebration, just like a fruitful vine. The image that we see in verses 2 and 3 here is of the early stages of family life. Back there in Psalm 127, the image is not of vines and olive trees that are blooming. Instead, it's the image of an archer. And you as a father, you have these arrows that are your children. And blessed are you if you have your quiver full of them. But what do we do with arrows? I mean, we don't just leave them in the quiver. We take them out and we shoot them, right? And that's kind of what we do with our children. We don't shoot our children. Don't misunderstand. But we do take them out and we shoot them into the world. And so that kind of describes the later stages of parenting. A lot of you've already shot all of your arrows, right? You've sent them out into the world, and now it's up to them, whether they do good or evil, whether they follow the Lord or not. But Psalm 128 instead describes the earlier stages of parenting. It describes the fruit-bearing stages of these young olive shoots that are just beginning to grow. A dad and a mom and younger children who are still at home and they are sitting around the table. And I think what we all know to be true, but what the Scriptures bear out, is that the consistent work that is done here in these early stages impacts everything that comes after it. What are you reaping in your home? Well, generally, that's what you've sown. What are you sowing in your home? Generally, that's what you will reap. And whatever impact our children might make on our own lives, or whatever impact they might make on the world as adults, and that's the last two verses of the psalm that we'll talk about here in just a second. All of that starts with the work we do with them when they're young. And there's not good or bad work that can't be undone in later stages, but that foundation is being laid here and now for the things that come next. I'll put it another way. Godly adults don't usually just happen. They come from godly young adults. And godly young adults don't usually just happen. They come from godly teens. And godly teens certainly don't just happen. They come from homes where godliness is emphasized and expressed when they were children. And so often it is the little consistent things that we might do that add up over the course of time. There is a sociologist, I think he's dead now, but by the name of Jacob Riis, and this is one of my favorite quotes of all time. If you're a basketball fan, the San Antonio Spurs, this is their mantra. But I think it's something that's been really helpful to me as a parent, because sometimes as a parent, you're just worn out. And the reality is, as a parent, you can't let those kids win. You're the one that has to win. And so I love this quote, and Stephanie and I talk about this. When nothing seems to help, I go look at the stone cutter hammering away at his rock, perhaps 100 times without so much as a crack showing in it. Yet at the 101st blow, it will split in two. And I know it was not that blow that did it, but all that had gone before. Summarize that. Pound the rock. Pound the rock in your family of what's important by being consistent day in and day out that these are the expectations of our family. These are the things that we do as a family to serve God, to serve others, and to learn from His Word. And it is not always the things that are perfect. This Norman Rockwell idea that we have in our mind of sitting around a table and everybody's got their Bibles open and, everybody's just perfectly behaved. Instead, oftentimes it is those moments where things aren't perfect, where they're far from perfect, but we have chosen to take the time to still do something spiritual that make the biggest impact. Pound the rock, and those little things will add up. One small example of this, are we communicating to our daughters and sons, but I have 2 daughters, that's where my experience is. Are we communicating to them things of a spiritual nature in our day-to-day conversations? This has been a couple of years ago, I guess. One of my daughters came up to me and she had put on a dress, and I don't remember where we were going. It wasn't church, but it was somewhere. She had put on a dress and she comes and she twirls for me as girls are prone to do. I've come to learn. And she asked me that so important question. Daddy, do I look pretty? Now, social, secular psychologists will tell you the importance of this moment. And all of the statistics that are out there with little girls and if they have a good relationship with their father and then those who don't have that relationship and the vast difference between those two types of women. And so here's the moment. Daddy, do I look pretty? What do I say in that moment? Well, I say yes, of course. But I could have just said, yes, baby, you look pretty. And that would be good, and that would be true. But I ask you, what would be better? As a spiritual father, as a father who's trying to raise them in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, what would be better seed that I could sow in this moment? So here's what I've said through the years when my girls have asked me, do I look pretty or something along those lines? I've said, yes, baby, you look beautiful. But is it more important to be pretty on the inside or pretty on the outside? Is it more important to be pretty on the inside or pretty on the outside? And they say, on the inside. And I say, and I'm so glad you're pretty on the inside and the outside. But you know the inside is most important to me, and that's most important to God. What am I trying to do when I say that? Well, I believe it, first of all, so tell the truth. But I'm also trying to lay a foundation. And that didn't always work out perfectly, did it? Sometimes, Brooklyn especially, she'd run up and say, Daddy, do I look pretty? I'm like, yes, baby, you look pretty, but, and off she runs, right? As soon as I try and say something. Sometimes it is, but is it more important to be pretty on the inside or the outside? On the inside, I know, Dad, I understand. But she did know, because we've talked about that over and over and over again. I kept pounding the rock. And in those extra, how long did that take? 20 seconds? In those extra 20 seconds, I'm trying to sow better seed, because battles over modesty come back to this. What they will use to attract boys comes back to this. Where they will find their self-worth comes back to this. I'm trying to lay a foundation with 20 extra seconds. That's all. Parents, may I encourage you to take 20 extra seconds to emphasize the spiritual in your response to your children at any age. And obviously, because I said so has its place, they need to learn obedience and immediate obedience. That has to be taught. And yes, baby, you look pretty and nothing more. That has its place. But don't miss the opportunities to sow better seed and reap better fruit. Does that mean that they're going to be perfect, or I expect them to be perfect? Of course not. But my two daughters are not going to run into the arms of some bad boy with bad intentions because they're not sure if their daddy loves them or not. That is not going to happen. Now, they may do it. They may run into his arms, but it's not because they're going to be unsure about my love for them. And they're not going to dress immodestly because they have no sense of self-worth about their own bodies. They're going to hear from me over and over, from me, from their mother, from the Scriptures, that their worth as someone created in the image of God extends so far beyond what they look like on the outside, or even what others think they look like on the outside. I will not allow the world to dictate their self-worth. And they're not going to make mistakes and be afraid to come to me as their father because I've been afraid or weird or awkward in trying to talk to them about things, or been unwilling to extend grace and forgiveness, or seek grace and forgiveness when I've messed up and they know it. And I'm going to control my temper. I'm going to be just and fair, but eager to forgive. I ask my daughters all the time, you can come to me about anything, right? No matter how bad things seem, with God's help, we can fix it, whatever it is, anything. And I'm going to admit when I mess up, even when I sin, and come to them asking for forgiveness. And my daughters aren't going to be carried away with every wind of doctrine and culture because they've never been taught any better. They might make that choice someday. I understand that reality. But it won't be because they haven't been taught from God's Word. And the reality is, I can come in on a weekend, fly in, fly out, and my girls aren't even with me. But I'm here to confess to you, we go through better and worse stages of consistency in regard to this. And I have regrets already, and they're 9 and 12 years old. And some of those things that I listed, some of those things might still happen with my daughters, which doesn't mean that we've failed as parents. And I know that I've been far from perfect. But their mother and I have done everything in our power to lay this foundation consistently while we can, to put in the work, to pound the rock. These will not be the reasons they go down those paths if they do. And I want them to know that they don't have to go down these paths just because others do. My dad is a great man, but like all fathers, he can be annoying to me. And there's something that my dad has said for years and years when people come to him and ask for parenting advice. He's always said, I know one thing about parenting. Parenting is hard. I was always like, Dad, that's so lame. Like parenting, you were a great parent. You know, you weren't perfect, but you were a great parent. Parenting is hard. Why don't you help some people out? They're asking for some help. Well, I'm here to tell you this evening, I know one thing about parenting. Parenting is hard. But I also know that it's worth it to do everything that we can spiritually to give our children the opportunity to know the Lord and go to heaven. A thriving family requires godly work. So what can be the impact of actually putting in this work? I meant to say this at the beginning of the lesson. People are panicking because we're still on point 1. I have one main point tonight. One main point tonight. And then we're going to quickly just go through the ramifications of that point. So we see a thriving family and the work that goes into that family. Well, what's the impact? If you put in the work, what could the result of this look like? Well, I want you to know that your parenting impacts your life. Behold, verse 4, thus shall the man be blessed who fears the Lord. Now, this word blessed is a slightly different word in Hebrew than the first two that we read. The first two are more focused on individual happiness. This is more focused on the favor that is received from the Lord. You're going to receive blessings from the Lord if you put in this work and you fear Him and you follow His commandments. The you that is used here is singular. You, personally, as a parent, are blessed by the Lord from Zion. And when the Lord and Zion are emphasized in your family, the Lord's going to bless you. And these tender shoots of olive trees grow, and you enjoy the fruit of your labor with them. You get to enjoy your family in latter days. He describes children and grandchildren. Instead of just trying to hold the family together in some way, you have the blessing of this family that loves the Lord and living a godly life in fear of His ways. Doing things God's way is always better. We know that. But may I suggest that it is often easier as well, even from a selfish perspective. Sure, doing the things in regard to parenting the way the world suggests, you know, children run homes, no discipline, no commitment to spirituality, affirmation of every whim of your child, whether godly or reasonable or not, that is easier for about 5 minutes. That's easier just in the moment. But it is harder, both in the medium and the long term. It is harder for you, it is harder for your children, and frankly, it's harder for everybody else who is brought into that vortex. We've always emphasized with our girls, hey, if you act right, you get to do more things and enjoy more things as a kid. If you know how to behave, you get to do more things. And if we can trust you to listen, to obey us, to trust us, that we're not going to ask you to do anything that you can't or shouldn't do, and then not throw a fit when things don't go your way, if you can do those things with a good attitude, you're going to get way more experiences than kids who don't know how to behave. Just a quick example of this. We went to Puerto Rico a couple of years ago, I guess it was. And it's interesting, at the time, the girls were like 10 and 7, I guess. And we were looking for zip lining. We wanted to do some zip lining. But it's amazing how many of these zip lining companies, they don't allow children. They don't allow younger children. And so the age range was usually 12 and over. But we found one, and so we go to this zip lining place, and they're the only kids there, and you can almost see on the faces of the other people, even the employees, oh no, there's some kids here today. But what was interesting at the end of that experience, because our girls know how to obey, they know how to behave themselves, at the end of that experience we had both people who were from the zip lining company and some people who were doing the zip lining with us come up to us and say, hey, they did so great. In fact, one of them said, I was really kind of worried about being on this with some kids, but they did awesome. Why? Because we're perfect parents, obviously. No, because we're trying to apply godly principles, like knowing how to listen, knowing how to obey, knowing that you do need to trust us, that we don't throw a fit when things don't go our way, that you must have a good attitude. All of those come from the Scriptures. And maybe they're not strictly spiritual in that sense, but I have seen in the in the medium term, I haven't seen the long term yet, but in the medium term, I have gotten to reap some of the things that we've sown as parents. And I am grateful because I enjoy my kids now because of the work that we've done earlier. And I want that pattern to continue in the future. I want to enjoy my kids as teens because of the work we're doing now. And I can't tell you how many parents have come up to us, oh, you got a 12-year-old, just wait until she's a teenager. I know there's hormones and all kinds of other stuff involved in that. I'm not naive. Well, maybe I am naive. I haven't experienced it. But I don't want to go through the teenage years with my daughters hating me and me hating them. And that begins with the work we're doing right now in this relationship. And when they're adults, I want to enjoy my relationship with my children because of the work we do when they're teens. And I want to enjoy my grandkids if I'm so blessed because of the work I did with my kids. And the reality is, this impact isn't just about us, it's about the generations that are to come. The Lord bless you out of Zion, and may you see the good of Jerusalem all the days of your life. Yes, may you see your children's children. What is the model, for better or worse, that most children use when they themselves become parents? It is what their parents did. And so a good way of thinking about this is, how do I want my grandchildren to be parented someday? Well, hopefully the same way I'm parenting my children. And again, this picture of an olive tree is powerful. Did you know that olive trees, under the right conditions, can live for hundreds or even thousands of years? There's an olive tree in the Middle East that they believe is 2,500 years old. And such is the case for a faithful family, too. The everyday, mundane things that you're doing now can have an impact for generations to come. And this isn't like to scare you. Oh, that's a lot of pressure. Maybe it is. But it's to encourage us. The work we're doing now matters, not just for right now. It matters for 50 years from now, 100 years from now. It matters, hopefully, when we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun. Estes says in his commentary on Psalm 128, or on the book of Psalms, the ripples of blessing continue to spread outward in the family and in the nation in the final verse of the psalm. The blessed person gets a glimpse of the prospect of seeing his grandchildren, a tangible evidence of the legacy of blessing that the Lord has launched in his life. And then finally, your parenting impacts not just you, not just generations to come in your own family. It impacts the church and it impacts the world. Peace be upon Israel, this psalm ends. Well, it's a psalm about an individual family. What does that have to do with Israel? Well, this is coming out of Zion and Jerusalem, and now it is all Israel that is impacted by the peace that is in this family. The right comparison would be to the church today, but know that it impacts the rest of the world too. What if we raise children to know their purpose early on? There are a number of folks back home in Lufkin who have done a great job with their children. I'm thinking of one family in particular, and the father in that family was an elder with us for many years. He stepped down just recently to do some traveling and some health issues, but he's still super involved with the young people. And he has adult children and grandchildren who are in their teens, but he teaches classes from time to time. And one of the things that he's done with the kids at Timberland, if you go up to any of those kids and you say to one of them, "You're salt," immediately they'll respond, "You're light." You're salt, you're light. Works the other way too. You're light, you're salt. Now, he started that when a lot of those kids were in elementary school. And now that some of them have already graduated, gone off to college, maybe a couple of them are even married. But what is that? Well, when they're little, they know there's a verse, but what does that mean? But as they get older, you know what that is? That's their purpose in life. Isn't that what Jesus tells us? That is what we are supposed to be, that is who we are, that we're salt and we're light. What if our children know their purpose from an early age? What if we raise children who know three things? They know who they are as children of God. They know where they're going on their way to heaven. And along the way, they've got to fill in all the blanks in between, but they know they're a child of God and they know they're going to heaven. And they know, number 3, how they're going to get there according to God's will and God's way as revealed in God's Word. If they know those 3 things, if we as fathers and as mothers can instill those 3 things in them, it will sow peace in our homes. It will sow peace in our churches. It will sow peace in our world, as much as depends on us. You have a glimpse of the future? That's what can be. But we have to put in the work to make it so. And may God bless us with His mercy and grace along the way. Thank you for your kind attention tonight. And if there's somebody who needs to obey the gospel, well, there is nothing better that you can do for you or for your children than to come to Christ, submit your will to His, to put Christ on in baptism, and to rise to walk in newness of life. If you need to do that even tonight, come now while together we stand and while we sing.